Good evening and welcome to Olde Tyme Taunton. I'm your host, Charlie Crowley, and tonight, like we do every week, we talk about our community and generate hopefully a greater amount of interest and enthusiasm in our city and hopefully a greater appreciation. That is our goal here. We've been doing this every week from, July of 1998. But we're live here tonight. We're our new season, which we started last week. But we're going to be talking today about Camp Myles Standish as well as its evolution into the Paul A.Dever State School. So we're talking about from military to mental health. This is a program that we've done in the past insofar as about the Camp Myles Standish. We've got a lot more pictures, different pictures here this particular time, and a lot of different pictures of Paul A.Dever State School, including some of the characters that we know and love from our days when we were there, as I worked there for about 11 years. So some of the superintendents and some of the hierarchy there that I'm sure everybody knows. So we hope that you'll join us here tonight, 774-501-1756. Before I begin the program, I just want to let everybody know that Olde Tyme Taunton does have its own Facebook page, which there's videos as well as old photographs that I put up there, and we're slow but surely putting up some of the videos on Facebook from some of past shows. So no matter where you live in the country, you'll be able to see some of our shows. And that was one of the complaints. They wished they lived in Taunton so they could watch. Well, now they can watch. Not necessarily live, but nonetheless. So tonight, when we begin Camp Myles Standish, I want to show you, this is the, just to give you the layout, it was actually on Bay Street where the main gate was, the same main gate that Paul A.Dever State School had. And this is a cover of the booklet for Camp Myles Standish, the Boston Port of Embarkation. The area where the camp is actually a sprawling 1,500-acre site that the federal government identified in the summer of 1942. And the headlines in the Taunton Daily Gazette, 200 men start work today on the Army camp. Now, it originally intended to open in January of 1943. However, they were so aggressive in wanting to build this particular staging area, the Taunton staging area as it was called, that they actually opened up October 8th of 1942. So just to give you an idea of the expansive layout of Camp Myles Standish. This is the, let me see, that would be the main gate. That is up where the industrial park is. And that's the, let me see, that would be the, let me see, no, the industrial park would be over there. There we are. Just to go back here, this is the Bassett Street entrance, that is the Bay Street entrance, and that is the Army camp where the hotel is today. So it actually went into Norton a bit. But what they did is that these were just farmlands, and there was a railroad nearby, and the railroad bed is still there near the back of what is now the Myles Standish Industrial Park. But when they built, they welcomed a number of different soldiers from United States, Canada, England, and Australia, as well as German and Italian prisoners of war. But this is the map that was in the actual booklet that each of the soldiers received. Now, when they built the camp, Henry Hopkins, who was here, the older gentleman, excuse me, to the left, he was the last surviving veteran from the Civil War in Taunton. And this picture was taken right around the time Camp Myles Standish was built. So many advocates of the camp thought, well, why don't we name it after him? However, Henry Hopkins was really only known to local residents. So they named a number of different topics, but they settled on Captain Myles Standish, because he was the first military leader in the old colony. So, and many of the school books that people had, no matter where you lived, in Arkansas, California, wherever, they heard about Myles Standish. So what they did is the workers were, there were union halls set up at various places in Brockton, New Bedford, and Taunton. So this is the building where Whittington House of Pizza would be, where it says, as you can see, the People's Drug Store, right across from the old Blink's Cafe. And what happened is that they would, in order to distribute the work fairly, they'd take electrical workers would be hired out of one community, construction workers and laborers out of different workstations, if you will. However, they started to raise the cost to get in the union at this time to the point of they were pretty much taking advantage of the applicants. So the federal government clamped down on them because they were trying to exploit that fact that you had to get a job, but you had to go through these particular unions. But one of the buildings that was on the site that was there prior to the construction of Camp Myles Standish was the Wampanoag Club. And this would later become the ad building at the Myles Standish Army Camp. And this is looking for, this piazza that you see there was overlooking Watson's Pond. And that was eventually closed in, and those were offices in later years. But this is what it looked like, and this is where Al Capone is alleged to have come out at various times trying to, not so much hide, but when things got a little hot in Chicago, he would come way out here in a secluded area where he could stay out of trouble, if you will. But what happened at the time is that they told all the residents they had to leave their property. And they were only getting the appraised value of what the property was worth in the 30s. And this was in 1942. And so many of the people complained about that. And Taunton Green was where the residents threatened to bring their cattle and put them on Taunton Green because they weren't given the fair market value in their mind to find comparable land somewhere else that had, say, pasture and stuff like that, because all of the area where Camp Myles Standish was placed was all farmland. So Mayor Merrill Aldrich in Taunton just got frustrated. I mean, every mayor has to put up with complaints, but this was war. This was during World War II, and they were over what he felt was minor issues. Looking at the big picture, the federal government came in and they took the land. There was no debating it. So Merrill Aldrich proclaimed to the residents of the North End, you know, we are at war here. And they said, yes, we are at war. We're here at war in the North End. And so it was a very, very difficult struggle for Mayor Aldrich during the time when Camp Myles Standish was being constructed. So if you have any thoughts about Camp Myles Standish, if you want to chime in, if you will, we're live here tonight. 774-501-1756. That's all it takes to come on board. Maybe you had a family member that passed through the camp, maybe not only as a soldier, but maybe you had a family member who actually worked at the camp. There were local civilians who worked here at the Taunton staging area, the Boston Port of Embarkation, otherwise known as Camp Myles Standish. So we're going to give you the evolution of the camp and how it evolved into the Paul A.Dever State School. So there's something there for all of you to enjoy, hopefully. What we're going to do is we're going to look at, I mentioned about the rationing. Many of the citizens were complaining that they had to be relocated, but they also weren't given a proportionate amount of rations that would enable them to do a lot more driving than they had planned, because now they had to go look for a new house somewhere. And but this is an example of the war ration book that residents had during that time. And that, see, they would tear off the little tickets, if you will, that were on the in that booklet. Perhaps you remember your parents telling you about it. Maybe you remember those particular ration books and having to use them during World War II. Also, what we're going to do is to show you the entrance of Camp Myles Standish, and there's the pennant. You had to have a pennant there that some of the souvenirs from Camp Myles Standish. That main gate, that island where that building is located, is still there, right at the main entrance of Paul A.Dever School, where the bus used to come up when it was Paul A.Dever, would come in right in front of this particular island. And you can see to the right in the background, that is the old Wampanoag Club that would later become the headquarters or the administration building for Camp Myles Standish and also for the Paul A.Dever State School. But this was an early version of the main gate, and then of course as time evolved, you can see they put a little building there in the center, just to the left of that little door to what was the Provost Marshal's station there. And then you can see over to the left the bus that's leaving. It's just leaving, going back downtown at the time. So that's what the main gate looked like, and it'd be right just to the left of this. That was the main entrance of Camp Myles Standish. So many of you have driven by this on Bay Street. Perhaps you're going up to Watson's Pond. This would be right on the left as you're going up across from the state boat launch. But with that island where that building was, the Provost Marshal, where I'll show you where this is, that's where that little marker is. We have a call. You're next on Olde Tyme Taunton.
Hey, I was just wondering, I used to work at Decatur Hopkins. That has to do with anything that's going on?
Decatur Hopkins, where that was across from the Columbia Cultural Center.
Right.
That used to be where the open air theater was, roughly in that general area. And that's where, we'll show you a picture of it as we go through the program tonight. That's where Humphrey Bogart and Lauren Bacall actually came to entertain the troops. Because where the Columbia Cultural Center was the camp chapel. Matter of fact, the foundation upon which the Columbia Cultural Center is built is actually on the foundation of the old camp chapel.
Okay, because some people used to say, we worked in Decatur Hopkins, that there was a ghost of a guy in an old army uniform,
Mm-hmm. Really?
Yeah, interesting.
Oh,
okay.
Yeah, you never know what you're going to see. Great, well, thank you. There's someone who worked at Decatur Hopkins, used to be in the industrial park. Because all that area where Myles Standish Industrial Park is today, where the former Paul A.Dever School, all encompasses that area where that was part of what we're calling tonight is Camp Myles Standish. So the marker that you see in this particular picture here at the center island, that is this close-up, that is a tribute to the over 1 million soldiers who came through Camp Myles Standish. And it's not only the American troops, but you had Canadian, Australian, and British troops here, German and Italian detainees, sometimes referred to as prisoners of war, sometimes co-belligerents. But the administration building of the building is still there. That was the headquarters for Camp Myles Standish and later on for Paul A.Dever School. But they had some of the additions onto it that no longer exist. Right behind this would be Watson's Pond, where they used to have a one-dimensional boat, and they would be able to practice climbing up the rope ladders, if you will, to get from a small boat up onto a large ship. And that would be something that they would train on, that particular area. Most of the time you were trained elsewhere, and they get the last minute instructions, if you will, as you went to Europe, and then they'd head up to Boston and go out on ship there. Colonel Charles Berkshire, he was one of the commandants or commanders of Camp Myles Standish. There was also another gentleman, James Marshall, and I just haven't confirmed it, but as I understand, James Marshall, who was listed as a commander here at one point in time, was also involved in the Manhattan Project. But I'm trying to confirm that in fact is one and the same individual. But that's what that building, that was the administration building for Camp Myles Standish, is this building. So there are quite a few of them still left, but they're in the process of being torn down as we speak. Near the Christmas of 2013 that we're in, many of them are being torn down. With this one, not yet. This is an example of one of the service clubs, and there were at least a dozen of these service clubs throughout the 1,500 acres. But this is a servicemen's club that many of you probably remember. It was transformed into the canteen, rec hall, and library. That's what it looked like in recent years, in the 1980s when this picture was taken. But what they did is they put a brick veneer on this building. It was the old original building from World War II. The Matthew Cummings Company is the one who built all of these structures for Camp Myles Standish, and J.F. Worcester is the company or the entity that did the landscape layout of the camp. This is a typical theater that was always across the courtyard from a service club. This, in turn, until recent years, especially when Paul A.Dever School was open, that's what it looked like. That was right directly across from the canteen and rec hall. But that was a typical theater, indoor theater, at Camp Myles Standish. Perhaps you remember that and have some stories about going up, especially during the Christmas season. Many of the dancing schools in the area would go up to that particular theater and entertain the patients there at the Paul A.Dever School. But we're talking about as we evolved from Camp Myles Standish into the Paul A.Dever School. Perhaps you have a question or a comment. 774-501-1756. We had a caller earlier. Perhaps you can join. Don't be shy. Anybody who misses this particular program, we're shown a repeat on Saturday evening and on Sunday morning, so on this very channel. So make sure that you tune. Plus, we'll be on YouTube and on my Facebook page as well to see some of these programs. We have a call. You're next on Olde Tyme Taunton. Hello.
Oh.
Hi, you're live. Go ahead.
How you doing?
Hi.
How's it going, Charlie?
Good. You're on the air. What can you tell us about Camp Myles Standish?
I started working there part-time when I was in college in 1981.
Okay.
And I worked there till 1986.
Mm-hmm.
And the only reason I quit, because I needed a full-time job.
Mm-hmm.
I couldn't find a teaching job when I got out of college.
Mm-hmm.
I graduated Bridgewater State College in 1986. And that was a very good job.
What did you do there?
I was a kitchen worker.
Oh, okay.
I started out training in the main cafeteria.
Mm-hmm.
And then they send you out to what they call satellite kitchens.
Sure.
And I landed a good job in the cottages.
Oh, yeah.
Cottages were the new buildings, cottage A, B, C, and D.
Correct.
Everything was brand new. They were clean. And the only thing that bothered me when I started that job was seeing these clients in their condition.
Right.
It was very tough. I mean, these kids have mental and physical health problems that really bothered me.
Well, when they as it evolved into the Paul A.Dever School, it was built for youngsters. But as we know, from especially if you were there, I was working there at the same time. The young clientele that were there initially stayed there and became senior citizens in many cases while they stayed at the A.Dever School.
Right.
But yeah, around 1981, 80-81 is when they renovated the old nurseries and the cottages, if you will. And the Fenton building, they gutted that and renovated that. So by the time you got there, those buildings were probably brand new as far as the interior of them.
Yes.
So but it's great though. Some of the stories you could tell about both Camp Myles Standish and the Paul A.Dever School is quite unique. Because
we had a lot of nice people there, and I'll tell you, for a college kid, at the time I was making, minimum wage now was $8. Back in 1981, 1982, I was making $6.75 an hour. That wasn't too bad.
Sure.
I remember taking home $83 a week, and I put gas in my car, and I lived at home at the time, and it wasn't that bad.
Sure. Sure.
That was a very good job.
Great. Well, thank you for calling.
And
Thank you. That caller, having worked at the Paul A.Dever School, the site of Camp Myles Standish, some of the buildings were still there. Whoops. But as we go on, just to give you an idea of what the camp looked like inside, these pictures were taken of the camp. As you can see, some of the there's many buildings, hundreds and hundreds of buildings throughout the entire place. That's a servicemen's club. I believe that was for offices, this particular club here. And this is a typical mess hall, and there are actually two of them until recently that still existed. One of them was called a prep shop, and the other one was called a female industrial, or the Maple Leaf building, because when the A.Dever School opened up, it actually was a male and a female side. So they kept a lot of those buildings. That's the prep shop. That's what it is. It was a mess hall. They put a brick veneer on the side of it, but it was the same building. Mess hall for the troops. And that's the other one. That's what it was called, the Maple Leaf building, or the female industrial building. When they call it prep shop and female industrial, it's almost like a pride workshop. They would be able to learn, with limited skills, would be able to put things together, products together. So they were quite a useful area. But this is the telephone center, which would be right in the area near the Cook building, or the Cirque building, as some people called it. But that's the telephone center at Camp Myles Standish. This is some of the workers. Perhaps you remember some of them as you're seeing them outside the telephone center. I mean, I have had people tell me that they worked at a restaurant downtown. Matter of fact, I'll let you know that when I worked at the canteen at the Paul A.Dever State School for many, many years, we had a young lady, her maiden name was Eva Klosky, but it was later on Eva Wester. Well, she worked in a local restaurant downtown, and her husband, who was from down south, was at the Army camp. And when he was on leave, would come down to the center of town. That's how they met. And he promised to look her up when the war was over, and he did. And they came back, and they were happily married for many, many years. And Eva Klosky Wester worked at the canteen in later years, back in the 80s when I was working there. Perhaps you have a story about either Camp Myles Standish or the Paul A.Dever School. We're going through Camp Myles Standish, and then we'll eventually lead into the Paul A.Dever School. So if you have any stories about that. Perhaps you recognize some of these people maybe that worked at the telephone center at Camp Myles Standish. Maybe they're a family member, an aunt and uncle in the picture. But as you can see, the snow up here, a lot of people from down south probably couldn't get used to this. But that shows you the grounds there at Camp Myles Standish. Perhaps you remember that. And you can give us a call, 774-501-1756. We've had a couple calls tonight. Maybe you can be the next one. And tell us what you know about the Taunton staging area, Camp Myles Standish, on Bay Street, Bassett Street area, all the area where Myles Standish Industrial Park is, and the former Paul A.Dever School. That was Camp Myles Standish. But this area, this particular photo, this is the hospital area for Camp Myles Standish, and that would be right where the Pepsi plant is, and the hotel. That would be the hospital area, and that was where the Camp Myles Standish, the Myles Standish State School began in this particular area when the camp closed. But these were what they call the BG building and Brigadier General buildings, and these were just basically small guest houses. And this is right on the road, goes by the old hospital at Paul A.Dever School. If you come in the main gate and take a left to go towards the hospital, and you go by the hospital, before you get to the Cirque building, on the right, up on the hill, you saw there's 3 or 4 of these buildings up there, and those were there during Camp Myles Standish days. Perhaps you remember them. That's an example of what they look like in more recent years. This picture was taken in the 1980s. This is the young lady that called earlier about Decatur Hopkins. This is the open-air theater that was roughly across the street of the current Columbia Cultural Center, and this would be where roughly the open-air theater for the troops. They would get modest entertainment here. Humphrey Bogart, Lauren Bacall would come here. You'd have boxers and very famous, notable people would come. But most of the time they were trained here, and then they would go overseas from here. We have a call. You're next in Olde Tyme Taunton. Hi.
Hi, Charlie. How you doing?
Good, good.
Good.
You're on the air. Go ahead.
You on my TV here.
Huh? Okay. Tell us what you know about Camp Myles Standish.
Yeah, well, I'll tell you about Paul A.Dever State
Sure.
School.
Okay.
I worked there for 37 years.
Mm-hmm.
And that picture of the maple leaf, that's the last big fire they had about a month ago, I believe it was.
Oh, really? Okay. Because the canteen burned down as well.
Right, yeah, that burned down earlier.
Yep.
And then the theater, that used to be where every Sunday or holy days, the Catholic priest would celebrate Mass there
Sure,
for
sure.
the clients.
Well, matter of fact, the fire that destroyed that theater there, I was working there at Endeavor in the canteen at the time, and the fire started in the room where the priest kept his garments or got dressed.
Right.
In there, and the curtain was a very old curtain, so it just swept up through that building. But some of the clients used to sneak in there. There was a way to get Jimmy the door open, and they smoking, and that's what happened.
Yeah.
So
And you talk about the cottages.
Mm-hmm.
When that state school first opened up, it was called the nurseries.
right.
They
right.
had clients there as babies in cribs at that time.
Right.
And like you said, some of these clients, they grew up to be adults.
Because originally it was intended for juveniles. The entire camp was originally intended for that. But
Right.
as we saw, there was a particular gentleman, I'll just say his first name was George. He told me, I asked him, and he was very, very bright, and he had been there pretty much his whole life.
Yeah.
And I had asked him, I says, how did he happen to come there? And he says that his father was a bricklayer. And every time during the busy season, he would, and his wife, I guess his mother, George's mother, had passed on. So his father was taking care of him, would drop him off there and leave him there during the busy season, and then come back in the fall to get him. And one particular year, he just never came back.
Right, yeah.
So he was, but a very, very bright. They used to walk downtown to many of the restaurants and stores in downtown Taunton, and he was telling me, now, but this is in the 80s, he was telling me what it was like to go down in the early 50s downtown to the restaurants and who had the best fish and chips and what the prices were. And he was, amazing memory. And there they are as patients at Paul A.Dever.
Right. Each client there was unique. You know, they had talents or something. You know.
Yeah.
They had one girl there that could tell her one time your birthday,
Right.
and she would tell you the day that your birthday is going to be on that particular year.
Amazing. She'd tell you your license plate, your phone number, and everything else.
Right. I used to tell her, why don't you pick me out a daily double in the dog track?
Oh, boy. Just what you
Okay,
need.
Charlie.
Thank you.
Another thing about getting back to Myles Standish,
Yep.
when I was taking basic training down at Fort Benning, Georgia, my section leader, Sergeant, he was a leftover from World War II. He was a career man, and he mentioned that he did come through Myles Standish, and that's where he left to go to Boston and catch the ship to go over to Germany.
And a lot of the units were decommissioned at Camp Myles Standish following the war.
Yeah.
And you'll find a lot of records of that, a lot of the famous units as well.
Right. Well,
great.
this particular sergeant, I mean, he stayed in the reserves after World War II. Then he got caught up in the Korea War, and so he went all the way to he could retire as a military pension.
Great.
Oh.
Well, thank you. Thanks for
Okay,
sharing
Charlie,
that.
that was a good show tonight.
Great. Thank you. Take care.
Yep.
That gentleman, you can join him just as well, 774-501-1756. That's all it takes. We're talking about Camp Myles Standish and eventually or simultaneously talking about the Paul A.Dever School, as we'll show some pictures of Paul A.Dever once we get through some of the ones of Camp Myles Standish. This shows you, we showed you, for example, the open air theater, but this is Humphrey Bogart and Lauren Bacall among two of the people who entertained there. But as you look through the WAC area, the women's soldiers, if you will, they were, as you come into the main gate and you go straight through out to Bassett Street and you take a right, beyond where the old waterfront was, that is where the women's area was. But many of the posters that you see, like this one, Loose Lips Sink Ships, they found a lot of them in the walls of some of the buildings at Camp Myles Standish, but when it was Paul A.Dever, they were rolled up in a tube, and so many of them, they gave them to me when I worked there. Because I used to put photographs up on the wall when I worked at the canteen, going way back in the 1970s. But this is the railroad area that later became the state surplus. This was down, the railroad yard was at the back towards abutting what is now Crane Landing. This is the actual, near the stockade that's down at, this was on the Fremont Street area near the railroad tracks, because a lot of parents would tell me that they would take their kids when they were being a little unruly, they would drive up Fremont Street and go by near Boundary Road where the stockade was, so they could see through the barbed wire at some of the detainees, and said, see, if you're not good boys and girls, that's where you're going to end up. Perhaps you have a story about Camp Myles Standish. Maybe you weren't locked up in the stockade, but you were, nonetheless, your parents would tell you stories about the Army camp that we know as Camp Myles Standish. And a lot of those buildings were taken down from 1946 all the way through. Many of them were still existing in the 1960s, and some still exist. They're in the process of being taken down right now. But for example, in the 70s, this was the groundskeepers building in the back of the Paul A.Dever where Milton Bradley was, but that was the fire headquarters at Camp Myles Standish. But this will give you an idea. This is the MP standing watch from a guard tower, looking out over Camp Myles Standish. Perhaps you can see how expansive the area is, and you're quite high up. And this is some of the barracks, how close they were together, because it wasn't built for comfort. It was built for necessity, because you were here a very, very short time, and then you'd be transferred off. Either you were leaving to go to Europe or you were on the way back from Europe. And that's just giving you another view of the way the barracks are all set up. But these are the troops as they're doing some limited training, but most of the major training was done elsewhere. And they were transferred here as the last step. As you can see, a lot of the troops, maybe your family member was processed through Camp Myles Standish, just give us a call, 774-501-1756. This is the picture we just saw, was there was a coal train. A train would come up, and that's where they would have the trucks that would go under this area, and they would dump the coal into the vehicles. And these actual cement supports, if you will, were there in the 80s anyway, before the expansion of the Myles Standish Industrial Park. Perhaps you remember that. See some of the utility buildings there at Camp Myles Standish. And then they'd put on demonstrations regarding the fire. This was a 1944 just to show you how to put out a fire. So all the workers that you'd see, they are civilian workers you could see in the background. Perhaps you remember some family member, grandparent, aunt or uncle maybe that worked there during the height of Camp Myles Standish, because there was a lot of activity. I have spoken to soldiers over the years, and they had said a lot of times they would, if they got leave, they would go to Providence or Boston, but a lot of times they go to Providence, not necessarily to Taunton, although a great number of them did. But as you can see, as they're putting out the fires here, it was a photograph that I recently came upon. But as you can see, the Officer Al Braga, the fire truck at Camp Myles Standish. But there were a lot of fires over there. Even at that time, there were a lot of fires. Over the years, the fire department's always been called upon to fire at the Paul A.Dever School or the old Army surplus. But there's, you can see the layout, and there they are at the train area, ready to march out at Camp Myles Standish. These were actual U.S. Army photographs that you see here, all in line, boarding the troops, boarding the trains. See that insignia out to the lower right? It's an official U.S. Army photograph. Some of the troops that were there, these were, I believe, some of the MPs at Camp Myles Standish. But if you're going to pass, this would Edward, I don't know if it's Bolton or Booton. Bolton was the, in 1943, July of 43, a permanent pass at Camp Myles Standish. This is an interesting building. This is the camp chapel, a mixed denominational building, because they had hold Jewish, Protestant, Catholic services here. But this is right where the Columbia Cultural Center is today. But they did not tear this down. They moved it to Milton. And it was used as the original St. Elizabeth's Church in Milton, Mass. But it was once the chapel at Camp Myles Standish. And there you can see all the troops trying to get in. So they would sometimes hold masses here, but also in the rec halls around, because, or they'd baptize people in Watson's Pond. Here's a soldier going to be baptized. This picture I got from the widow of one of the chaplains at Camp Myles Standish. She gave me a whole stack of pictures back in the late 70s. Perhaps you've been to Columbia Cultural Center. That was right near where the chapel was. And to the left of it, between there and Quality Beverage, is the grotto. This was built by the Italian soldiers who were detained here at Camp Myles Standish. But it's all overgrown because, as you can see, that's what it looked like in recent years. But originally, this is what it looked like. It shows you how clear the area was. See, I'll show you. That's what it looks like now, probably more overgrown. But that's what it looked like, very well maintained, but it was maintained by the Italian soldiers. Oops. This is Guy Madeira and Colonel Messeret, I believe it is. And that's a signed, autographed picture that I received from the widow. And there's Ray Miller, Chaplain Ray Miller at Camp Myles Standish. But this is an extraordinary picture because, as you know, during World War II, the U.S. military was segregated. So these are the black chaplain corps by Chaplain Jefferson, who's here. But they were segregated. They weren't what do you call it, blended together with all the other troops until afterwards, when President Harry Truman, came up with an executive order that basically did not segregate the troops after that point. But you can see the segregated services with black soldiers were held in some of the rec halls and some of the barracks here. Dayton Drake at Rec Hall number 6, the services. But you had the Jewish service by Chaplain Bosker. You had the Father O'Brien on the Catholic services there at Camp Myles Standish. And that's the hospital, the ward, the chapel. And the altar in the Italian soldiers that were detained there had their own chapel So it gives you an idea, a cross-section of how Camp Myles Standish operated. But there was always things going on in all the communities across the country to buy war bonds. But the citizens of Taunton donated money that led to the construction of this particular vehicle, the USS Kittiwake. And you can see the sign on it, donated by the citizens of Taunton, Massachusetts. That's the USS Kittiwake. As you can see from the submarine force, USS Kittiwake. Downtown Taunton had the USO, or the Federal Recreation Center as it was called, but the USO was on where the Bank of America is today, and that would later become the CYO, Catholic Youth Organization building, but this burned around 1972. Up where behind the Columbia Cultural Center is where the open air theater was, and that's what it looks like. Well, it looked like this in recent years. There was an attempt in the 1980s to make wider spread use of this natural formation, but that's what it looked like at that time. But also people going through the area would remember if they were going just walking or hunting. You're not supposed to hunt in there, but they did. But that's some of the remnants of the U.S. Army camp, Camp Myles Standish. That was right off of Fremont Street near, I'm trying to think what's there, some of the street, Paula Drive in that area. The barbed wire was there 1980s before Perkins Paper went down in that area off of Fremont Street. But they're a very, very common scene as you drove through there during the 70s and 80s, it was there. But Arthur Schroeder was a German prisoner of war who contacted the Attleboro Sun, and then they got a hold of me, and I got a hold of Dr. Hanna, and we met the gentleman, and he went through Camp Myles Standish. And we had an interpreter there so that he could tell us what his experiences was like at Camp Myles Standish. Although the recollections were very vague, they really didn't have that much to say other than their just overall experience. But following the war, there was a consideration given to the use of the former Camp Myles Standish site for the United Nations. It was on a list, a somewhat short list, if you will. Ultimately, New York is where the United Nations ultimately was settled. But because the government owned the land, it had its own wells, its own septic system, not septic, but sewer treatment facility. That made it attractive, plus the railroad tracks nearby. And it was ideally located between Boston and Providence. But a lot of the barracks were shipped off-site. Tremblay Movers, those buildings were former barracks. Art's Bakery on Washington Street, that was, I believe it was Washington Street, or Bay, I think it was. That was the former barracks. But this is coming around near Durand's. They're bringing it on a flatbed around the Taunton Green. This is the them using it. They would use every way you can to move them, but this wasn't the ideal way to do it. But they would just put it on the top of a truck and just drive it down the road like that. So imagine seeing this coming in the other direction, but these are the old barracks, dismantled and moved from one place to another. As you can see, getting ready to put the roof on top of the truck. But this is, as I mentioned earlier, the hospital area for Camp Myles Standish, but it was the original site of the Myles Standish State School. The site was, I believe, for $1, was given to the Department of Mental Health for a state school for juveniles, for those mentally retarded youngsters in the region. In Massachusetts. Many of them come from all over. So Jack Ewalt was the doctor, the first superintendent, if you want to call it that, of Myles Standish State School. He was the first person in charge of that. And later, that's when it was part of a network system in the state. And then it wasn't until around 1950-51 that Richard Cook became the superintendent of that. And so technically, they made it an independent school within the state of Massachusetts, part of the Department of Mental Health, but they considered it an independent school. So therefore, Richard Cook was the first superintendent of the Myles Standish State School as an independent entity. And they received a lot of assistance from Governor Paul A.Dever, and that is why they were able to build new structures, move out of the old hospital buildings and move into what they call the L-shape buildings over near the Bassett Street area. That's the grave of Paul A.Dever up in Roxbury, West Roxbury. But there is the Governor Paul A.Dever at the groundbreaking on June 23rd, 1950. Richard Cook is to the right, the superintendent, longtime original superintendent there, and through the efforts of Paul A.Dever, they were able to construct the more modern facility, state-of-the-art facility. Consequently, the Gilbane Building Company is the one who actually renovated the new high school recently. They're the ones who constructed the L-shaped buildings. That's the groundbreaking there, June 23rd, 1950. But they also had Adlai Stevenson was there at the time, and some of the dignitaries. We hear John Kennedy was there at this groundbreaking. There's the foundation being built for the old power plant in June, actual 1950. There's the power plant in February of 1951 as it was going up. But they dug tunnels in there. They connected all the buildings. There we go. See, as you can see, that's the cafeteria building being constructed at the Paul A.Dever School. Now, at this shows you an aerial view of the area. If you're familiar with the old grounds, that area where the even numbers buildings were actually the female side. The center of the campus was the cafeteria, and then the odd numbered buildings were the male side. And there was a fence separating the male side from the female side. And then when you wanted to go to lunch at the cafeteria, they'd take the tunnels that went from each building that all led to the cafeteria. That shows you another aerial view. I don't know if it's light enough for you to see, but just how the L-shaped buildings are set up there, with and Bassett Street would be to the lower center of the picture. Just to give you a close-up, there's a lot of the buildings at the time this picture was taken, they still had a lot of the old buildings, as you can see at the top of the screen, that were from Camp Myles Standish, that those were later taken down, and the woods just really took over and encompassed that whole area. But that's the Servicemen's Club, one of the Servicemen's Clubs that was renovated as the rec hall. And the canteen would be to the left, the rec hall's in the center, and the library was over to the right. And that's what it would look like in the 1980s. As you can see, the canteen would be right to the left as you're looking at it. And the rec hall was actually dedicated around 1986 to Jerry Willett, Mama Willett, as she was called. She was a longtime worker in the rec hall, and she passed away suddenly, and they dedicated it in her honor. And there I am at the canteen. That's where I worked I was there 11 years, but not all 11 at the canteen. But you walked in there, and we were behind the counter. If you wanted candy bars, soda, coffee, or sandwiches, you'd come up to the counter and order it, and then sit down at the here. They had a jukebox and a pinball machine there. Spent many days there, and there's bulletin boards in the back of the room that I used to put photographs up a long while ago. That's the theater across the street, and of course, what it looked like during time as the A.Dever School. Perhaps you remember something about the Paul A.Dever School? That's the engineer shop at the Paul A.Dever School, and these were actually two barracks that were put together, and they put a brick veneer on the side of it to make it blend with the more modern brick buildings that were put up. 774-501-1756. We're live here tonight. I'm Charlie Crowley. This is Olde Tyme Taunton. We're talking about the Camp Myles Standish and the Paul A.Dever School. And the A.Dever School, many of the buildings still existed when it was at its height. We'll show you some pictures of some of the characters who actually controlled the Paul A.Dever School. It'll bring back some memories. This is the prep shop, again, with a workshop, almost like a Pride workshop, on the grounds of Paul A.Dever. That's the female industrial. There's the cafeteria that would later be offices, but that was with one of the gentlemen who called earlier, said he worked here. Matter of fact, my wife, Mary Jo, worked here back just for one summer, I believe around 1978. That's what it looked like inside the cafeteria, those very light aluminum chairs they had there. Many a time they'd get thrown across the room. But that's the laundry at the Paul A.Dever State School. There's the power plant, and the garage would be right behind it. And that's a typical L-shaped building while it was under construction. I believe that's probably building 1. If I'm not mistaken. And there's another view of it. That's where they get the name of the L-shaped building. This is just as you come in the gate. I believe, I'm not sure if that was building 4 or 6. As you come in, the Bassett Street gate would be just to the right of this picture. This is the Fenton building. These were where the young, profoundly retarded patients were at the Paul A.Dever School. I believe this was built around the late 60s, right around late 60s, maybe early 70s. But just after Dr. Cook retired, you had Ann Lewis, who was the superintendent of the Paul A.Dever School. And then when she retired, Dr. Ellsworth Pearl. He just recently passed away. He lived in Middleborough for many years. Cy Pearl, as they called him. He was, matter of fact, superintendent when the blizzard of '78 came in. Perhaps you remember them. Here's some, I'm drawing a blank on some of the names here, but the second from the left is Warren Thornley. The next one there, I'm absolutely drawing a blank, and Nastri. He was I believe, a nurse at that facility. Of course, Dr. Pearl, Edmund Sullivan, the chief engineer in the center. Then you had, just to the right, is Charlie Colton, a longtime steward and later trustee at the Paul A.Dever School. I don't know the lady to the right is Mike Shea, who was later the steward there before Fred Schaefer took over. And the gentleman, I'm drawing a blank on the gentleman to the right, perhaps you recognize him. 774-501-1756. There's Ed Sullivan and Dr. Pearl. Also, some of the people that work there, higher-ups with Dennis Eve, assistant superintendent, Frank Guiney, John Varaca, plant superintendent, Gene Coble, Cindy Hardy. Bernie Simons, that's a more recent picture. He's out in Missouri at the present time. Randy Burnup, Joe Cavilhog, Andy Forbes. Anybody who worked there during that time, the 70s and 80s, remember those people. Henry Torini actually was the head of the president of the union, and they had a strike around 1980-81. And that's what this picture was taken there during that time, trying to stop one of the cars coming in. They were probably yelling "scab." But this Al Bayless, Mike Thomas, and the late Richard Sylvia, strong union advocates there. But later superintendents were John Riley, or Jack Riley, and Dr. Mukherjee, that led the evolution of the Paul A.Dever School, which no longer exists. But perhaps you remember that. This is Building 1, and this is the Harvey burial ground that's in front. That was there long before Camp Myles Standish was ever put in, when this was all farmland. But that cemetery it's not soldiers buried there. That is the cemetery that existed prior to the A.Dever School. This is sometimes referred to as the Cirque building. It's the Cook building, named after Richard Cook, the early superintendent of the school when many of the L-shaped buildings were constructed. And this is, I believe, planned to be renovated, or at least is being explored anyway. And that's, of course, the main gate for the Paul A.Dever State School. And some of the views on site, and that's inside the tunnel, the one to the right. The tunnels went all the way to, they had rooms off of the tunnel, but they went all the way from the L-shaped buildings all the way to the cafeteria. Perhaps you remember going through there? But all of that site of what was Dever, the farms that they made, they grew all kinds of food for their operation. Now the Myles Standish Industrial Park pretty much encompasses the area for Camp Myles, what was formerly Camp Myles Standish and the Paul A.Dever School. Because in my last year in office as mayor of the city of Taunton, we were able to formally sign on behalf of the city the acquisition of the remaining portions of what was Paul A.Dever to the city, controlled by the Taunton Development Corporation. And a few years earlier, I had signed the documents that actually led to with the help of others, don't get me wrong, to get the wells, the Dever wells, are part owned by the city of Taunton now, so and controlled. So it's a water source that many people remember going up there and getting the jugs of water out of there. No treatment plant, they just get the spring water right out of the ground during the 70s when they had the boil water in the city of Taunton. But this just shows you some of the back area, the army camp of the Dever, where it was the industrial park just starting to grow. So all of that would be Milton Bradley would go there. The area in the lower left is where Crane Landing Condominiums is. But it shows you it's in its primitive state at that time, but that's the industrial park now, Myles Standish Industrial Park, one of the most successful industrial parks in Massachusetts. And the Taunton Development Corporation is largely responsible for that, of volunteers, business people. But the site of Dever was used for the movie Surrogates as a site, and that's the part of the set that was built. That's right where the playground was, right across the street from the cafeteria. This was built for as part of the props for the movie. And you can see they put panels on the roof, solar panels, and that was a farmer's market in the movie. As you can see, they planted all this for the movie. But I wanted to just to give a plug in for the Old Colony Historical Society. Katie McDonald, new leadership there at the Old Colony Historical Society. We're open 10 to 4, Tuesday through Saturday. If you haven't been there, it's one of the biggest secrets. If you haven't been there, it's time you should. Stop by. Just a wonderful group of people, and they'll give you a real treat going through our local museum at Church Green, 66 Church Green. I do this program every week because I believe the more you know about Taunton, the more you love it. I've been doing this since 1998, and I'll continue to do it in the weeks and years to come. But I hope you enjoyed it tonight. About Camp Myles Standish and Paul A.Dever. Next week, I haven't decided what the topic is going to be, but tune in next week for another edition of Olde Tyme Taunton. Thank you and good night.